Hello, I'm Peggy Donathan and I'm with Donathan Studio Glass. Today I'm going to do a little bit of a demonstration on how to do the soldering of a copper foil project. I've had my soldering iron warming up. I have my flux, which is a water-soluble flux. I have my solder, which will be a 60-40, which is a good solder for a copper foil project. And as you can see, I placed it on the board. I have all my pins around the project holding it all in. You'll always want to make sure that when you do your project that all the pieces are exactly where you want them to be, to make sure that the lines around specific areas are correct as to what your pattern is. Sometimes you'll have a little extra space right here that you might want to move things around just a little bit to make sure that it accommodates the difference. That's what's so nice about copper foil projects. Today we're just going to get started on this project. I wanted to give you a little bit of ideas as to how to do the soldering. So what I'll do to get started is I'll take this with the brush and I'm just going to get the border part kind of put together so that way it won't move. So I'm going to put some flux in these areas. I use the sponge on my soldering iron stand to clean it off and also to cool it down when needed. You never want to take your soldering iron to touch that copper foil. That is just a tape only. So if you put too much heat on it without having that solder on it, it will pull the tape off. So the way you want to use it is you want to take your solder, put it on the iron, and let the solder drip on your project. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to tack some areas around here to get my border kind of staying where it won't move around. And as you see, the soldering iron is just melting it to exactly where I want it to be. As long as there is flux on the area that you're putting that solder, there shouldn't be any problem with the solder applying itself to that copper foil. You want to put your flux on the area that you're going to work with, like that. And depending upon how quick you are into applying your solder, if you're not as quick as I am, that you would put a little bit smaller of an area. And then I just take my solder and I put my solder on my soldering iron and I just let it melt and make it flow. Okay, like that. Now, sometimes we as painters, if you've ever done any oil painting or acrylic painting, we like to look at the soldering iron as being like a paintbrush. And so what we'll do is we will use it on brush strokes, and see what it does when you do that. It kind of puts texture inside of the solder itself, and you don't want that to do that. What you want to do is you want to take your soldering iron, place it inside the metal there and let it melt and just drag it is what you want to do, like that. And then it'll take pretty much all the texture out of there. Sometimes you get to a part where you've placed too much of the solder and you have this horrible mess of this giant ball of solder on there like that. What you can do is just take it, it hardens immediately from the soldering iron. You want to take that solder and just take your soldering iron and drag it. Anywhere that there is flux, it will apply to your project. Okay? Now, when I do my projects, I like to do frames on them that are zinc or lead cane frames. And when I do that, you want to not take that solder all the way to the edge. So about probably 1/8 of an inch or so, I stop that solder from the edge. So that way I have enough room to apply a zinc or a lead cane edge. And see how smoothly that goes right there? It's just dragging it right along it. The solder line looks really good. Stained glass is really an art that you look through the colored glass through the windows and through the sunlight. We usually do that within like a 10-foot area away from your stained glass window, and we don't notice the soldering lines. So a lot of times when we first start this, we have to give ourselves patience and figure that there is never a perfect solder line. You can actually see an artist that has done stained glass projects for 30 years, and if you go look at their stained glass projects, you will actually notice that they are not perfect. It's just, there's no way, because what happens is when you get that solder applied to that, it just does what it wants to, is what happens. We're going to continue doing this a little like that. And then what happens is sometimes you'll pull up your iron and it'll get stuck. All you have to do is place that iron inside of there and it'll melt that metal all the way down your channel. I like to do my soldering where it's a rounded, where this channel is like a rounded. Some people like to do it more of a flat. So if you kind of look at this, what we'll do is I'll kind of show you the difference between the two. Which means if it's a flat on the solder, it would just spread it a little bit more. Some people like to look at like that. To me, I think the construction is much better when it's rounded. There's more metal in it and it's more sturdier of a window. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go ahead and do this whole side and then clean it up a little bit on that side and then flip it over. So we'll be back in just a little bit.